Kia ora. In this video, we're going to have a look at the advantages of simulations versus running an event by hand. In this example, we're going to have a look at flipping a single coin. Now, this doesn't meet all of the requirements of the new NCAA Level 1 standards because it's only a single event, but I think it's a very good example to allow the students to tangibly see the advantages of getting a computer to run a simulation rather than doing everything by hand. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to come into NZGrapher and we're going to go into Data and Event Recorder. For this one, we're just looking at one coin and the outcome could be heads or tails. I don't need any of the other options here, so I'm going to press Start Recording. Before I start flipping my coin, I'm going to change this graph type here to a running proportion, and the event that I care about is the coin. Now at the moment we've got no data, so it's not going to show anything, but what we're going to do is once we start getting the data, we're going to see that showing up in that graph area. So let's start flipping our coin. The first one I got was a tails. The next one I got was a heads. Then a tails. And a heads. And a tails. And a heads. And a tails. And a tails. And a heads. And a tails. And a heads, and a tails, and a tails, and a heads, and a heads, and a tails, and a heads, and a heads, and a tails, and a heads, and a heads, and a tails, and a heads, and a tails, and a tails, and a heads, and a heads, and a heads, and a heads, and a tails, and a tails. I'm going to stop throwing my coin at this point. What we can see is that initially, because we don't have much data, there's quite a lot of variation as we add new points in. And as we go further along, each point that we're putting on is making less and less of an impact on the overall proportion. But we do still sometimes get long runs here where we got 1, 2, 3, 4 heads in a row and then a couple of tails in a row. It's quite common to get that, and then you'll end up with this line in kind of different places depending on what's happened when you've thrown your coin, because there's a decent amount of randomness involved. So what I want to do now is I want to have a look at this instead of throwing the coin hundreds and hundreds of times to see what happens in the long term. I want to have a look at a simulation with the coin to see when that variation in the data kind of starts to settle down. So I'm going to come into data and I'm going to go into probability simulation. So again, I've got my coin and I could have a heads which has a probability of 0.5 or a tails which has got a probability of 0.5, and I'm going to run 500 trials and press create dataset. So what this has done is it's created a data set here with 500 coin flips for me. So I'm going to change this graph type to a running proportion, and the event I'm looking at again is that coin. So what we can see here is this time when I was running simulation, the first one I got was a heads rather than a tail, and you can see there's initially quite a lot of bouncing around. It bounces around quite a bit all the way through 200-ish even, drops back down, and then by the time we're getting to about 350, it's really started to level off at about that 0.5 mark, but there is still a little bit of variation going on. So looking at this, if we can see that it's going to take about 350 plus trials before it really starts leveling off, then it seems silly to try and do that all by hand when we can use a computer to help us. So that's why we use simulations rather than just trying to necessarily do everything by flipping coins and rolling dice by hand. Hopefully this has given you some ideas of things that you can do in your classroom. You could run something similar in your class with more than one coin or with a dice or a couple of dice. And you can have a look at how the long run probability starts to settle down after a period of time. But that period of time that it takes to settle down is actually quite a lot more than what we've often done in class, where we've gone, oh yeah, 30 trials, that'll be about right. Hopefully that's been some food for thought for you, and all the best with the new standards.